N is
Okay,
the relationship. Okay, we can just start.
Yeah, we're here. Okay, very good. Go ahead. Hey, no, this is a conversation with Alexander Reed Lund, a brilliant man who wanders around in the intellectual deep dark web that we hang out in. And we had a UTOKing thing. We thought we'd talk about mind and whatever else emerges in this little vector of conversation. So, hey, Alexander. So,
great.
Anyway, there's a little frame for a little UTOKing conversation rather than any official podcast or anything. We'll just pop this up on the YouTube thing and share with the IDW if it goes a particular way.
So I've been super interested in your map of the mind recently. And I wanted to, like, a lot of it overlaps with some of the ways I view the mind. And as we were touching on before, especially the part where self-reflection is probably some form of virtual representation of the interpersonal. Even if it just is, it feels like it just happens within ourselves. Maybe there's some form of virtual representation of society, maybe in like a Dunbar archetypical way, something like that. So, but you have 3 steps and then some addendums to your.
It's a lot. It is a lot. You know, I've been working on this cathedral for a long fucking time. So yes.
So maybe we can go through it one step at a time, and I can ask some questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Is that cool? Okay.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit in terms of where I'm intersecting with this, okay? Because it's important to kind of know. So I was even telling you just off camera that it's important to know, I think, just UTOK itself, the Unified Theory of Knowledge, emerges out of the problem of psychotherapy at first, okay? And that is in the practice area of being a psychological doctor. What do we use to understand what's happening to people? What are their problems? What's the best way to live in the world optimally? So behavioral and Freudian and humanistic, all of that systems, they have different angles on all of that, okay? And then I asked, well, why don't we organize these different schools of thought based on the science of human psychology, okay? Now I've been trained in the science and I didn't realize it at the time, but actually when you get trained in it, you realize what you're really being trained in is a scientist as a methodologist, okay? So that's really a behavioral methodologist is, this is how you ask scientific questions, frame like measurement and things like reliability, validity, you run randomized controlled trials or you analyze this. So it's really the methods and epistemology of science you actually get trained in, okay? But nobody agreed on the ontology of psychology, okay? And I didn't know that at the time, but that it becomes apparent when I make this shift where it's like, okay, well, what we mean by human psychology, if you drop down and you say, well, what do you mean by biology? Pretty much people are, there's a big difference between things that are living and things that aren't. There's things in between like viruses, but everyone agrees a fucking bacteria cell lives, that's alive, that has all these features. We can wonder about how emergent it is, but we can all say biology is the science of that shit, that living process. And that all grows. And then it extends up into another emergent vector somewhere, okay? But then you get no agreement on where, say, biology leaves off and psychology begins, okay? And then you get into psychology and people differ completely about what their primary reference point is in the field, okay? So there's no, is it psyche, is it mind, is it behavior, is it human, is it animal? There's no agreement. The technical definition of the term of psychology, at least in the United States, and that is the big, right now, United States produces the vast majority of textbooks. That is where psychology is actually broadcast from. And so it's important. European systems do differ, but in the United States, psychology is defined as the science of behavior and mental process, okay? So behavior and mental process are the topics. And it turns out that actually the way the field is defined is it defines behavior epistemologically, it turns out. And that is, it's defined by the methods of science give you access to behavior, and then you infer mental process. So the scientist sees the behavior, measures the behavior, manipulates the behavior, and then builds models of the mental processes that are then inferred that connect to the cause of the behavior. Okay.
And this is something we would see in like DSM, for instance.
Well, the DSM's a little different, but yes, in terms of the way you would study the DSM. So the DSM is actually produced by psychiatry. Okay.
Yeah.
So psychiatry is a branch of medicine. So all psychiatrists are medical doctors, which means they learn biology, then physiology, anatomy, and pathophysiology first. Then they move up into the domain of the mental through medicine. Okay. Is the dominant domain. There's a big arm wrestle between psychiatry and psychology. Okay. So psychology has sort of been this weird, confused discipline since its beginning about what it is. Okay. But yes, if we were to then study, say, DSM, you would say, oh, there's the behaviors associated with depression. So we'll measure those behaviors, and then we'll infer the mental processes that cause that. And you can then, because there's no unified approach about what mind is, okay, there's no, and everyone disagrees, then you have to bring your research question or your school of thought or some combination to define your variables. It's called the operational definition of your variables. And then you say, oh, I think this is what I mean by emotion or cognition. This is the model I use, and this is how I measure it. And then I apply those methods, and then I build something. I say, in fact, I did this for my dissertation. I tested cognitive errors in relationship to depressed mood. So I would measure people's tendency to make inferences, either positive or negative. I then actually experimentally manipulated that, gave them bullshit feedback, either that they were really great or really shitty. Then I measured the change in mood and measured the extent to which their tendencies to make cognitive errors influence their tendency to move up or down in relationship to their interpretation of the system and the mood they felt after. So those are all the behaviors I would measure, and then I would infer the underlying mental processes based in this case on the Beckian cognitive model. Aaron Beck is a famous, actually, he was trained as a psychiatrist, but he actually lives in the world of psychology, or lived. He passed away about a month and a half ago. He made it to 100, and then he passed away, long rest his soul. So anyway. Okay, so why did I give all that background? Because it turns out that to at least from where I'm sitting, the right way to address the issue of mind is through this problem of psychology. And people come at it from all these different angles, but this is really the best way. And what UTOK actually helps you see is that we've massively entangled the following things: scientific knowledge from subjective experience. Okay, there's this entanglement, fundamental difference, sort of objective third-person empirical frames for describing the behaviors in the world versus the subjective first-person experience of being. Okay. In fact, if we go back to the early empiricists like Locke and Hume, we see this being made between primary qualities that are accessible like mass from some third-person measurable thing because they so-called exist in the world, versus secondary qualia, qualities of things like redness, okay? That electromagnetic wavelengths exist in the world as primary, but my experience of redness, that's a secondary qualia. So you divide the world. When the emergence of science, a pretty early division is to try to divide the world into what would be out here as primary qualities that would then be accessible by a third-person systematic measurement, empirical quantification process, versus the secondary qualia qualities that reside inside of the construction of the phenomenological experience of being by the knower experiencer. So they split these two kinds of empiricism pretty early. Kant tries to put them together and reformulates it, but that's important just to know historically. And I know
so from a scientific standpoint, we are like you have like 1A and 1B. Exactly. So like we can look from an outside perspective on some sort of behaviors and draw a conclusion and fit them into systems. And then how I at least understood your dissertation, in some sense, you're doing the opposite. You're finding an internal connection between what choices a person makes and their mood. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I mean, right. So there's a couple of different ways. All right. So now that's the basic structure. Okay. That we started to frame. Now let's get into what I then learned about UTOK is like, how do you define science? Versus subjectivity? How do you define behavior, by the way? And then how do you define mental processes? In fact, my current book right now is on the metaphysics and ontology of understanding what science is, and then understanding that behavior actually is about science writ large, okay? Then psychology is about a specific kind of behavioral process from a scientific perspective, okay? And then we need to map the mental processes with a clear descriptive metaphysics that references the ontology and then ties that together with a meta theory that allows us to causally explain what the fuck we're talking about. And that's what the unified theory does, what's called mental behaviorism, versus the standard approach, which I really call methodological behaviorism. Methodological behaviorism is epistemologically grounded. Oh, I'm a scientist because I do the epistemological methods of science.
Yeah.
Mental behaviorism, oh, this is the fucking thing in the world that we're talking about. And here's the collective way to talk about it that affords us comprehensive coherence in describing what the fuck the field is. And that's what we're missing. And so this is what it's trying to fill this gap. Okay.
Yeah.
So we now then, with that in frame in mind, we can go to, people will know the tree of knowledge, the first branch on the tree of life behind me. Okay. And this gives rise to the descriptive metaphysics of UTOK. Okay. And what it says is that it's a new map of big history. Okay. Big history is the basic frame for natural science that says, hey, we can track the evolution of cosmic emergence on the dimensions of hyper time. We use, global time, the time from now back to Big Bang, if we ran a clock independently and give rise to global hyper time, which is, 13.8 billion years, right? And then up from that place of, simplicity or distributed information that's not organized into systematic structures that have properties of increasing complexification. Okay. So that you go from particles to atoms, atoms to molecules, molecules to cells. All right. That's those two axes are the generalized big history map. Okay. Yep. And that's well established. Almost all basic models of science, when they try to give a big picture, give these two axes of time by complexification.
Yes.
Okay. So the tree of knowledge says, yes, that's right. But it says that picture is missing something very important about the nature of emergence. Okay. Yeah. And ontology. What it says is that we can definitely see two fundamentally different kinds of emergence, okay, by the shape of the tree of knowledge, because of its different four cones. And it divides the world. It says there's a beginning state of energy information singularity, okay, that then goes through an inflationary Big Bang. And that gives rise to the observable universe that's accessible to us given our current methods of science. Okay, so that's important to note, because the base is we'll call it an implicate order. It's not exactly the way Bohm used it, but basically underneath matter is an energy information implicate order, according to UTOK. Yeah. Okay. Out of that weird thing, that energy information, space, time, all of that shit exists weirdly in this thing, comes the emergence of matter, capital M matter, in the language of is the sort of the classic, what Newton studied, the classic matter in motion field of existence of planets, okay, and then goes down into atoms, and then we get into the quantum field shit that's at the base. Okay, does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay, so then we see the evolution of complexification of matter within the dimension of matter to go to atoms, to molecules, stars, and then galaxies, whatever the hell they're organized at, whatever's across assemblages and scales. Okay, and so that's the matter dimension. The physical sciences that humans build to create epistemological / ontological maps of this ontic reality is, so the physical sciences map the matter dimension into the energy information, that correspondence. Okay. Yeah. But then what the tree of knowledge shows is a different cone emerges called life. Okay. Yeah. And it jumps through a particular kind of portal, like a singularity or whatever, a complexity building feedback loop. That basically, although we don't know exactly the steps, essentially gets a replicating organized structure. So a replicating structure like RNA, those kinds of things, with an organizing container that create what's called a Markov blanket around it through a lipid structure. Yep. And then there's some proteins that give rise to a certain kind of self-organization to maintain free energy flow through the system, because it creates self-organization, and then replication. Okay. Yeah. And once you get into self-organized container, energy information flow to maintain that, and then replication, it's a kind of, you wave a little magic wand, because there's a lot of shit we don't know, but ultimately you hook that and you create a natural selection operating on genetic combinations that give rise to cellular structures that have this complex functional adaptive design. And that's what we call life. Okay. Yeah. Absolutely. And what it says is that kind of evolution, okay, because of the way hooks an information processing and communication network that creates a complex adaptive plane of existence that is qualitatively different in its emergent structure than, say, the shift from atoms to molecules. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want to say atoms to molecules, or physics to chemistry, is one kind of shift, but it's within a dimension. Then the chemistry to biology goes through molecular biology, and we can follow the substance trail. But the nature of the complexity building feedback loop, and then the organizational structure, is properly construed as an information processing and communication network. And that information processing communication network is a fundamentally different complex adaptive behavioral plane that's properly labeled living processes or life.
Yeah, absolutely. And then we get, and then the question is, when do we get mind?
Exactly.
So, so where does, so we're talking about, we have two different forms of mind, at least. We have the mind of pure sensation.
Yes.
So which we could probably call that maybe sentience, perhaps.
Yeah, totally. That's exactly the word I use.
Okay. And then we have like the self-reflective mind, which is sometimes called consciousness.
Right, which I would call self-consciousness.
Self-consciousness, yes. So
actually, I'm gonna go ahead.
Yeah, but we're not gonna continue.
Well, so then there's this whole other thing that I'm raised as an American. Okay.
Yeah.
So what American empiricism did is it tried the classical with John Watson into B.F. Skinner gives rise to a thing called behaviorism. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
All right. So this is key to
a little bit familiar with behaviorism.
Yeah. Well, basically, behaviorism is essentially awkwardly ties to science.
Yeah.
It tries to get rid of mind as a concept and says we just need to stay with behavior. Okay.
Yeah.
And then indeed, this actually helps me bridge the gap from what we were just doing there to what you get to. So essentially, I'm going to insert what I call mind layer 1 mind, and then get to layer 2 mind, which is sentience into experience and a private subjective experiential self, and then a justifying mind that's mind 3 for me. Okay. The self-conscious, self-reflective.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what the tree of knowledge shows, okay, with life is that an information processing and communication network system gives rise to a whole new complex functional adaptive design, cells, organisms in an ecology that are behaving in weird ways relative to the inanimate earth beneath it or whatever. Okay. So then what I'm going to argue is that actually we can, of all then the living kingdoms that emerge, there's one kind of kingdom, the animal kingdom, that grows out of life in a very similar way, the way that life grows out of matter. Okay?
Yeah.
And what you see is that what life had to do is it had to create a Markov blanket, and then it had to create an information processing communication network. And then it grew into these multicellular colony systems or single organisms that were multicellular. Yeah. Okay. Like a plant, like a tree, although there weren't trees exactly back then, but whatever. There were. And then essentially what we're going to see is that this thing is going to get lifted and then moved horizontally in the world. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what an animal basically is. It creates an opportunity to lift the sensory motor whole of, say, a plant-like thing and move it around in the world as a whole. Okay. So like if you go and you just watch a flower bed and you see the bees and the birds in the flower bed, the bees and the birds are moving around like a whole fucking entity. And the flowers are just fucking sitting there. Okay.
Yeah. So just to be sure, why is the movement of particular importance here?
Well, it becomes absolutely central because fundamentally what it needs is a centralized control system to regulate the movement as a whole in relationship to the world, including the moving others that one's communicating with. Okay.
Sure. So you do have things like, let's say, mushroom spores.
Totally.
Which do have some form of directional movement.
Yep.
And do have, like, let's say, like through mycology, have well, if you want to use the concept sensations, because here's the next question then. When do, and if we take like the Thomas Nagel perspective, when does the quality of being like something come into being? Is there something which is like to be a plant?
Right. I don't think so, but we don't know. Okay. I don't. My argument is that everything that we can empathize with that falls under what Nagel was talking like in relationship to the something that is like to be, is something that I like to be inside. It has a nervous system, and in general, and brain in particular. Now,
okay,
that's.
But that is from perspective from your empathy. So what you personally empathize with is the way that you, not in a negative sense, but projects what is capable of having faith. Yeah.
Well, it's certainly it's empathy. There's logical argument. There's a whole host of different things, and there's a acknowledgement of a lot of agnosticism. Okay, in terms of like what we don't know. Okay,
there's definitely agnosticism involved.
So there's a lot of agnosticism here. What I would say is that a reasonable conservative scientific stance is that everything that we would recognize as sentience requires a nervous system. Okay, so I mean, it felt experience of pleasure and pain. Now, I want to be clear, there's a lot of nuance in language here. Okay, so I use the word consciousness in a multitude of different ways. Okay, one way to define consciousness in its most broad and general way is from an external perspective, where you observe what I call functional awareness and responsivity. Okay, the system itself sees, responds to, has sensory inputs for certain things in the environment. It responds with functional awareness and responsivity to those things in the environment.
Okay, but like if you have a forest, for instance, then trees can sense if other trees are not getting enough sunlight, and send their nutrition. So how is the nervous system different from that response, which I would probably also see like as a sense response with a purposeful action?
Well, and organisms do sense response with purposeful action. Totally. Okay. That's what I mean by functional awareness and responsivity. Organisms do that. You cut your finger. If you cut your finger, you cut yourself, right? We do this all the time. Somehow, this is not a nervous system based thing. It's an organism based thing. You sense that this is not the body plan that this thing is supposed to be in. And all of a sudden, cellular mechanisms, chemical mechanisms are released that have some sort of ability to detect the deviation from the form about where it is and regenerate that structure. So it has clearly cells have sensory responsivity and functional awareness in that sense. Okay.
Absolutely.
So at the biological level, has consciousness at the level of behavioral analysis of their complex adaptive functional awareness and responsivity. Okay. So we can certainly see functional awareness and responsivity in the living world. We can certainly see it in robots too. We build things that demonstrate functional awareness and responsivity. Okay. But and this is just a behavioral third person analysis of their response set. Okay.
That is possibly also an argument against John Searle's idea of all forms of consciousness being biologically based. Because if we can have programs performing like what would we see, a similar task of similar complexity, why shouldn't they also have this basic?
This gets into this is why our terms need to be so clear. If we're just going with functional responsivity and aware, like this defined as functional responsivity, and this term references that thing in the world, well then sure. If that's the functional form we're talking about, then you build a machine that fits that functional form. And yes, absolutely, you would have that. Okay.
Yeah. And then we come into maybe like something like the Chinese room problem. But like when like sensation, or the quality of sensation isn't perhaps really needed here. So the question is, when does it arise, or is it something which like let's say Whitehead or other thinkers would suggest that, well, like this basic forms of sentience in the form of subjectivity maybe goes ways further back before biology.
Totally. Right. So I believe this. We can think about the behavioral field of matter in relationship to there are nodes of entities that are positioned in the world based on, and then they have access, informational access to whatever the network is. So if you're a particular atom in a particular place, there's the within view, and then there's the exterior view at just the basic metaphysical description of that's the atom that we're referencing, and that atom has information energy access to a subset. It doesn't have information access in a totally different place. Thus, it has positionality, object field positionality that then is within or without relative to that.
Yeah.
So at the very least, there's a descriptive metaphysics that creates analogous systems, okay, to things like a cell that's in a place, animal that's in a place, or a person that's in a place. So there is, when we do behavioral field stuff, we see the kind of container positionality parallel that gives a metaphysical parallel between where the entity is relative to the field. And so you definitely get that dynamic, okay?
Yeah.
So I would say there's clearly a metaphysical parallel at the level of concept and category.
Yes, and we come into the agnostic point here as well, where, well, that could be a form of proto-sentience. That there could feasibly be something which it is like to be an atom. Sure. And we can still apply this, let's say, interior, exterior.
We can definitely, at the metaphysical level of positionality, we can apply it, clearly, okay? Yeah. At the level of, well, what do we need to infer? Then you have to then say the scientific, if we're in the world of science, okay, then there's and you're going to make a particular claim, all right, in my estimation, you then need to justify what that claim would be, all right? Yeah. So for me, and I'll get to this, I think I can justify a pretty clear claim that says pleasure and pain, and the felt experience of what we would call things through our five senses intersect with pleasure and pain to give rise to what I call the base of sentience. Okay. And the proper way to frame the base of sentience is mind two. Okay. And the place that sentience makes most sense that it emerges needs mind one. And mind one is where the nervous system is. The nervous system consolidates biological processes at the complex functional awareness design, places a centralized control system inside of that. Okay. And then gives rise to a higher order computational control system over the biological system, which is allowing the animal to get up, move as a fucking sensory motor looping whole, where the organisms, although they're complex functional design, things like mushrooms are unbelievable, or the whole fungi world is like this quasi-animal, quasi-plant growth system that it spreads out into the system, uses unbelievable statistical problem-solving shit to weave its way in complete complex functional behavioral terms. But to say that we have good notions that there is something that is like to be a fungi without a nervous system at this juncture, my bet is, well, no, everything that tells me is from a neuropsychological sentient perspective, all that we identify at the level of genuine felt experience of being bottoms out in sentience, and the sentient system comes online with the basic elements of the brain nervous system.
Yeah, I mean, I understand it from the point of view that if we take our own experience as the let's say the constant in this, we can project that to other things which has nervous systems that are similar to us, but in some sense, then we are already equating our experience with our nervous systems, and we don't necessarily know if they are correlated or causative. 100%. So I would say, like, but when you say things like, and I think that's made a lot of sense, like movement. Well, when I look at trees, for instance, they also move to get the best angle of their crown in relation to the sun, and they also have sensors in the sense of being able to tell what like moisture levels there is in the ground or how much nutrition they are. But then again, I think you had a brilliant point as well about, well, I might sense that I've been cut, but I don't have a qualitative sense about my cells moving to coagulate the blood. So that is not only a non-self-conscious act on my part, but it's also a non-sentient action on my part. I'm not even aware of my heart beating if I'm not like paying attention to it. So it's an autonomous system. But the question is then, if this autonomous system in itself also has a form of let's say sentience, or like what I understand that it might sound like totally speculative, but I think the reason why I'm trying to make the point is that I would probably try to avoid to necessarily say that the relationship between sensation and the nervous system is causative, where it could just be correlative.
Okay, right. So this is a whole nother, right. So we're in total agreement here. Let's just summarize the way we're in agreement. Okay. I don't know what the hell it's like to be a tree. Okay.
Yeah,
And
sure.
it might be something that it's like to fucking be a tree. We could discover that. And I'm like, oh my God, that's unbelievable. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
So we want to be clear about that. I certainly am not claiming I don't know. I'm trying to claim what I know and what the justification is for it, and then simply saying I'm also skeptical. It's very plausible. There's nothing like to be a tree, especially if it doesn't have a nervous system. We can definitely say that biological systems exhibit complex adaptive responsivity, the body, without our at least meaning of the word sentience. Okay, so that if you knock somebody out with anesthesia, the body will still heal itself and metabolize its food and do all sorts of communication stuff to keep its complex system alive in a vegetative state, to use the old Aristotelian term, at the level. In other words, it's living at a biological level, but we knocked out anything that we would be identifying as sentience. Okay, at the very base, the system has gone dark. It's a zombie, but it's still engaged in biological learning.
So do we know? Like, okay, let's say that if you have a lot to drink and you inhibit your I think it's the prefrontal cortex, right? You can still have experiences which you sense, but you will not be able to remember them.
Yep.
So do we actually know with anesthesia that you're not having any experiences, or that it's just the trick of the memory?
No, that's another good question, right? We don't exactly know that. Definitely, there are arguments to be made that that's what's going on, but because we're still dealing with what I call, when I use the term hard problem, I'm referring to the actual neurobiological engineering mechanism by which some sort of physical instantiation, however long down it goes, gives rise to the felt experience of being. Since we don't really have a good frame for that, we have that's what I call the hard problem, and or at least my framing of the ontology of the hard problem is like, how the fuck does that actually happen? Since we don't really know, then we're definitely in a place of agnosticism. Okay.
Yeah.
So my system works as follows. My system basically says clearly, let's be clear about what we do know. We do know that living systems exhibit complex functional adaptation.
Yes.
Okay.
Because we can see that externally.
We can see that from a behavior. Clearly, no one can dispute that the tree is sensing shit. It's distributing shit. It's engaged in that pattern. We're crystal clear on that. You can argue that trees even learn some. Okay. There's some elements of learning, and they certainly demonstrate responsivity. Cells do that. Okay. Then the question fundamentally is, well, we know that you and I feel shit. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So there is something that's like to be me and you.
Yeah.
So we know that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, at least I'm projecting, like, you are so similar to me.
Right.
That I assume that you're sensing, but in some sense, I don't really know.
Well, okay. So exactly. Now we get into what actually do we know and what do we mean by know? Well, you actually have to infer my mind too. You have to infer my mind too.
Yeah. From my own. Yeah.
But you live in your own mind too. So you don't have to infer that at all. You're presented with your mind too.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
And that is what I would call an ontic epistemic. The ontic epistemic of mind too, of your own unique epistemological portal, is a given, meaning you simply, when you become conscious, the witnessing function comes online and the base of perception presents itself as pure awareness. And then that's an ontic epistemic, meaning that you've gone through the system is an epistemic system, and it constructs in the world, whether it's accurate or not, it constructs the experience of being in the world. That's the virtual experience of, my experience of redness is simply and I presented with this cup. And that just is for me in relation. So that's the ontic epistemic. And we sit inside an epistemological portal that's across an epistemological gap, meaning I can never see somebody else's subjectivity. Okay.
Yeah. So I completely agree.
So that, by the way, is what the whole third person, first person in science was trying to do. Get out of our unique idiographic subjectivity, get an intersubjectively generalized objective positionality in some world that's independent from the unique epistemological portal. Okay?
Yeah. So in some sense, like when you're saying that, like, everything with the nervous system is sufficiently similar to me that I am willing to attribute it the same faculties of qualia that I experience myself. Exactly. It is a conservative estimation, but in some sense as well, we can't really know. And I
Totally.
think that same not knowing goes for trees and
100%.
maybe even molecules.
100%.
So I would say that what we are projecting from has a lot to do with what ontological basis we are working from.
Totally.
In the sense of, well, is sensations a byproduct of the nervous system, or do we have a different explanation for sensations?
Totally. So the proper term of UTOK would be a unified theory of human knowledge. I mean, you add the human in there, but it's a good qualifier. My earliest articulation of it was the integration of human knowledge. So one of the things that I mean by that is we are epistemological reference points, both in terms of our experience of being and then our intersubjective justificatory structures are all contextualizing the frame of knowing and positioning that frame of knowing in the universe that is going to be then somewhat dependent upon the particular structures of reference that we're using. We're not getting out of a God's eye view. We are dropping our best, even that's true of even fucking science, okay, from my vantage point. So it's a human knowledge structure. And then the question is, to what extent can we possibly be justified in potentially transcending our human knowledge to make transcendent claims that would be human independent? I think that's a great question. I think you can get outside of, you can claim, I think the matter dimension is made up of atoms. And of course we know it's made up of particles and energy, but I think if my claim as a transcendent realist would be, if there was any propositional alien structure else out there that engaged in analytical reasoning that analyzed the universe, they would come to the conclusion that there were atoms that made up of that made the suns up in their universe. That's that's my thought experiment. In other words, if aliens got here and they built shit and they thought like we did and they had any kind of propositional science like we did about mapping the universe, it'd be super interesting if they had a totally different physics than we did. Like, it's like they didn't believe in atoms. They're called, they had an entirely different category of mind. That would show just how unbelievably epistemologically dependent we are on our little human frame of reference, okay, and the categories of mind that we're dependent upon. I think that's a great question. Anyway.
Yeah, I would say that it's possible. I would say it's possible to build the same system of science we have with a totally different ontology, because like it's epistemologically founded in us using empiricism to find results that can be repeated, right? But our ontological explanation could differ wildly. I mean, for my, like the way I see it, there's no reason why we couldn't work from an alchemical frame. So where we also attribute feelings and the properties of soul to physical matter and still build space rockets. Because that's just the narrative. That's the narrative structure we are engaging with atoms. There's no okay, so if you go to like Leibniz, for instance, right? Like he had the idea of monads, which the world was built out of these nomads. And what nomads was really pieces of soul. And then you had the ultimate nomad, which was God. And like all this sounds like nonsense to a materialist scientist, but you could have a system based on Leibniz, which would be just as effective in creating the current technologies we have right now. So because it's a narrative, it's a story we tell, like we can engage.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, and so yeah, I definitely agree that we're operating in a physical or reductionistic narrative, or at least big part, and we're building shit based on that particular narrative, and they could be operating from a wide variety of different metaphysical, metaphorical containers that would be just as effective in translating instrumentally the world around us into things that we could build and use. I would totally agree with that. Yeah, that makes sense.
So that's so in some sense we have to at least separate, like, because there is, of course, the pragmatic perspective of, well, if it works, right? So there must be some truth insofar that it works. But I would also say that sometimes I think we take the narrative structure for granted. And like so regardless, we can never and this is like the limit of knowledge and Hegel's absolute knowledge as well. Like I can never for certain know whether or not a tree has feelings or not. So it will not really affect. It might affect the way, if I was, let's say, a biologist or a mycologist, it would not affect the way I did empirical research, but it might affect the way I described it, or the way I related to nature on an ethical level,
100%.
or the way we engage with each other, like the way we behave, but not necessarily from any pragmatic perspective of like what's the best way to grow a mushroom garden. I might just use some more romantic language instead.
Yeah, no, I totally. There's a interesting book on a woman, I think one of the first women to win a Nobel Prize in biology, called The Feeling of the Organism. And it was exploring her as a woman and the way in which she was in the world and contrasted to men and all of that, you know, and it gave rise to a fundamentally different, you know, sort of ontological feel for the organism, literally. And you can then see that as sort of a shift about, well, people, you know, the masculine energy and its architectural kind of systematic approach, as opposed to a more relational dynamic approach in relating to it. And then her capacity to unlock its mysteries, and as part of her relating to it in that way, would be an example of that potential. And
then we might feel like, well, okay, but the materialistic scientific version is at least more conservative. So from an Occam's razor kind of perspective, well, that would be the most reasonable to assume, but I'm not sure I agree with that, because like we are taking one ontology, which is that of materialism, over like all of these other possible ontologies.
Yeah, right. So I want to get out of the whole, I mean, UTOK tries to introduce totally different ontology, basically. And it basically says, listen, you want to, I mean, the ground of the ontology is this energy information field that we barely fucking understand at all. And it notes that an energy information field is very different than classical matter in motion. So whatever the fuck mechanical bouncing around billiard balls of Laplace and any other physical determinists that had space-time absolutism and then complete mechanical unfolding force equals mass times acceleration in a specifiable three-dimensional space, one-dimensional time field, we know that's fucking wrong. You know, that's, we know that's not the base of our ontology. So you have to then get underneath that and be very aware that if you start talking about this non-local energy information field, you actually now are starting to talk about it in a way that's actually much closer to mind in some ways. At least metaphorically. And then I think some people like Bernardo Kastrup then tries to create an ontological base of this that feels like a stretch to me. But at the very least, I can at least get it. I want to say, hey, there's energy information. Then we have matter, then we have the ontology of life. And then this ontology of life is this information. And I think this is as conservative as you can be, but no more conservative. You get excessively conservative when you say, oh, it's just a bunch of chemicals. That's real. It's not observably what it is. It's a much more complex than that. And then
we go into reductionism, of course, where we reduce other fields into like a singular system.
You know, Daniel Dennett describes good reduction, which is basically a continuity dynamic of substance and time. There's an emergent evolutionary dynamic, and there has to be some degree of lawful consistency, or at least habit consistency, usually habits a nature frame, in the sense that we should be suspicious that the second law of thermodynamics is probably not being violated with cells. We should be, if we come up with that, we'll be like, probably not.
It could be violated, let's say, with emotions, right? Because like I don't gain more energy if I lay on my couch all day, right? If I go and exercise, I might even get more energy. So in some sense, I am violating the second law of thermodynamics.
Well, right, but I mean, in terms of the basic, I mean, when you get in it, whether if you're an open system, you know, which everybody is, you're an open system, you take in energy, and then you have energy to distribute. That's my point would be is, and some organisms almost seem to violate this. This means if you make it a closed system, it shouldn't be able to adopt negentropic organized structure without any additional energy information put into the system. And generally, I don't think that's ever been violated. But anyway, that's my basic point. Certainly, there's a negentropic process. In other words, the free energy is collected, put to work, and that's what makes life so unbelievably different than what our expected organizational structure. No, I argue that.
What I was trying to say was really that from a phenomenological point of view, like if I'm taking an interior perspective, like it doesn't necessarily obey the same laws
100%.
We would expect matter
no,
to do.
clearly you cannot translate that in. Although there are some interesting parallels, like for example, in behavioral investment does utilize what's called the first principle is the principle of energy economics. So there is a way to angle yourself to understand what organisms are doing, like animals will do. Like the default for an animal is to spend the least amount of time and effort and risk to get an outcome. Okay, so animals are situated to spend the least for behavioral effort relative to return, although there are exceptions definitely to this. Generally speaking, there's a behavioral investment equilibrium where an animal will spend the least amount of time, risk, and effort to maximize the return on reward. So that's an example of, and that's not really second law of thermodynamics, but it's a derivative of the implication for a system that is going to internalize free energy, utilize that to work to maintain a complex organization that's far from equilibrium, aka high negentropic state. In order to do that, it's got to be very aware of the forces of entropy that are pulling against that. I mean, not consciously aware, but I mean, the organizational structure needs to be aware of it.
Yeah, so that's very interesting.
So anyway, I'll say really quick, because I didn't. So essentially, the unified theory basically says this, or just tracks the evolution of the animal kingdom. Okay, so you have fungi, which are really more sophisticated probably than plants. The whole mycology world of fungi and lichen, all this other shit doesn't matter. Anyway, you get the analogy the unified theory uses is that just as you got an mRNA, RNA, DNA structure that afforded a particular information processing system that would then control or regulate the organized structure of the genetic, epigenetic unfolding of a cell. A very similar higher order function happens with the nervous system, so that then the nervous system becomes essentially like the DNA to the cell. The nervous system to the animal is like DNA to the cell, only at a meta level of information processing communication network. And what you basically see is that because of the lateral space-time sensory motor movement of animals, it opens up this whole design space to live in the world of what the behaviorists call behavior. And that, what's that? Can you not hear me? Hello? You back? Hello?
You froze. Can you hear me?
I'm back.
Yeah.
Are you back?
Yeah, I'm back too. Can you hear me?
Yep, we're back. All right.
Okay, you froze for a second. I don't know what happened.
Yeah, well, that's it's amazing it happens at all.
No, you were saying that that the nervous system was analogous to DNA to this.
Yeah. So essentially, then the nervous system becomes a consolidated computational control center. Okay, at the higher order level. And you see the evolution of, there are distributed sense systems, there are motor systems like in jellyfish that are operative, but they're disconnected. The Cambrian explosion shows the consolidation of a sensory motor control system that then starts moving the animal in what I call sensory motor looping. John Vervaeke gave me the word mindedness. So then that is a minded animal. And that is what on the tree of knowledge then is represented by the dimension of mind, which is kind of a neologism. I introduced the concept of mind to represent the sensory motor looping that we see in animals that exhibit complex functional design of what was animal behavior that makes the behavior of animals very different than the behavior of plants. Okay.
But is it only because like you're returning to the movement? But isn't it like a matter because like plants migrate in some, like we see plants migrate, we see mushrooms migrate. So like, is it a temporality issue or?
That's like, I mean, well, it's the nature and magnitude and temporality and degree of coordination of the movement of the animal as a whole. And so it's you get a qualitative shift in the capacity of an animal, especially actually you add, it's a brain. Essentially, you get a brain and what's called a complex segmented body. Okay, you get a brain with a complex segmented body, and then you get a qualitatively open design space for movement that is radically different than the rest of the animal kingdom. I mean, the rest of the kingdoms apart from the animal. So it's complex active bodies with brains that set the stage for what I would then call mental behavior, which is the kind of behavior that we see animals exhibit that is qualitatively different than the kind of behavior we see in the living world, the rest of the living kingdoms. So that's the So there's a qualitative shift. In the quality of behavior.
So let's say like what could it be an example of one type of behavior which let's say the rest of the animal kingdom, not the animal kingdom, the rest of the biological kingdom could not replicate as opposed to the animal kingdom.
Yeah, so here's the analogy I use to show these. So now we have three things. We have matter, we have life, we have mind. Mind meaning mindedness of it. And then I put because I put 3 cats in a tree. Okay.
Yeah.
One's dead, one's anesthetized, and one's normal. And you drop.
What anesthetized? That's anesthesia.
Yeah, anesthesia. It's knocked out.
Okay. Got it. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah, okay.
So you drop them. One drops. That's material behavior. The dead one drops, flops, and it's material behavior. Okay.
Yeah.
The next one drops, it flops, but if it's breathing and its body is staying, it's alive, that's living behavior inside of its as it exists. Okay.
Yeah.
The other one drops on its feet and takes off. Okay.
Okay. So can we add a fourth cat? But, okay, let's say one of them is paralyzed, but still able to sense.
Totally.
So this is not anesthesia, and this is not being dead. So this is like, we have mind here, but none able to react, right?
Totally. And what you get there, where does that come from? The argument, if you trail the evolution, basically what happens is this, okay? Here's the evolution. I'm an early consciousness or early mind two-er. People debate about this, but here's what I see as mind two. In fact, here's a great book right here on it, called which basically outlines this exactly the same way I do here. Hold on, sorry. This book, it's called The Evolution of the Sensitive Soul. Okay. And the origins of learning and consciousness. All right. Nice. It's a great book. And basically it outlines, I followed this. There's another book over here. Again, 6 books that really that have come onto the scene in the last 15 years that really articulate this view. There's controversy, but here's the basic view of those of us that adopt an ancient origin view of consciousness in the animal kingdom. But believe that it emerges in the animal kingdom as follows this way. So essentially what happens is you get this complex active body with a sensory motor control system that's happening here, okay? And in order to move in dynamic relation and learn with immediate feedback, essentially what happens is a broadcast system that yokes the input of activity at the sensory input with the energized response at the output and creates a loop whereby then it sends up a broadcast function that's well described in terms of pleasure and pain. Okay. So whereby you basically have an input that's referenced against a drive system that's activated in relationship to an output. Okay. So you sense. Okay. So essentially it's like, oh, here you sense something out there that you want to eat and you move toward it. Okay. And as you ingest it, it's reducing the discrepancy of where you want to go to what you want to be. And as you reduce that discrepancy and you expend energy, you move in the approach direction and it creates a satisficing system of signaling, which would then be to create the base of what's called a valence qualia. Do more of that, AKA pleasure. And probably the pain version would probably even come around first, which would be like, pull that thing away in relation. So it connects the sense. Yeah, go ahead.
But we can pretty much replicate the same thing with the bacteria, right? Or simpler forms of life, or simple cells even.
At the functional awareness and responsivity, you can certainly demonstrate, again, you can definitely demonstrate approach avoidance in single cells, okay? Yeah. But you certainly, the question fundamentally though, is that, well, when we're building the human psyche, we're basically, because we have access to the human psyche, all right? And we're building the human psyche. And I mean, put it this way, if if it were the case that if you did a heart or stomach transplant, or you cut off your arm, and then you could somehow determine that actually that hand is still feeling shit after it's disconnected from the brain, then that'd be very compelling. We don't know. I'm simply saying that again, that gets into agnosticism. We don't know. But the issue is that all sensory experiences that we know of are brain correlated. And as a function of that, and then you're trying to build the system about what's the organization of this psyche, which by now I'm going to mean the subjective experience of being. Well, the idea that it goes into the body through the regulation of pleasure, pain, and you can connect the sensory input brain systems with a drive brain system, with a behavioral response brain system, and then you can yoke that up with essentially the satisficing of positivity and the rejection of negativity in the pain system. That gives you a consolidated base of what I call mind two, the base of sentience, pleasure and pain, which in order to have that experience of what it is to be like, the implication is that you need the conservative implication is you need a brain. Some people will come along and say, you can't even know that a fly experiences shit, or anything. I mean,
sure. But I would say that then we are dealing with the same problem of not knowing what is outside us. What I'm really challenging or asking questions to is on what basis we are deciding what we choose to project ourselves into.
Sure. Well, we want to be we want to be totally conscious of this. To me, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that psyche is neurologically mediated. So there's a huge amount. If you then take away the neurological mediation, imputing psyche becomes very, very difficult. And that's why I say it emerges out of mind one. So to me, it's a lot easier to argue that it emerges out of mind one than that it emerges in the fungi world.
Yeah, I mean, for me at least, it seems like the conscious experience of mind two, to some extent, even emerges out of mind three, because there's the self awareness of having a conscious experience. So the way I view it, and we, as we talked about, have talked about before, we come from, like, we have different purposes for talking about mind, so we have some different lenses on.
Sure.
But sure. I would probably say that from where I'm sitting, mind one and mind two share a lot, because we're, in some sense, we're talking about qualia. And then when mind three is added, there's the sensation or the awareness of having qualia.
Totally.
But when you are talking about, let's say, the nervous system, and I get that it's a more complex system than let's say a simple cell, but I would say that the simple cell shows a lot of the same behavior from an external point, which is like responding to external data, moving with purpose, which we are now using as an external frame of reference for why I believe that you have, like, you're obviously performing way more complex actions than a cell. But if we are using, like, moving purposefully towards pain, towards pleasure and away from pain, like, I would say that a cell is doing the same thing. I would say a chemical reaction is not doing that.
Right. So for me, my language is that, yes, we can observe, like, functional awareness and responsivity. There's a question mark about what we would consider to have. There's a subjectivity to the cell, even, I would say, in terms of its fundamental complex adaptive organization. It's a Markov blanket. It's organized in processing information in a particular way. But for me, without a mediating nervous system, to then impute anything that is like to be a bacteria cell is a stretch. And I'm not, like, close to that. We may learn that down the line. It's just agnostic. And for me, when I'm building our model of psyche, and what we know has psyche, it's mediated through the nervous system. In the absence of that, then it's like, So anyway, that's kind of where, and again, there's no, I think we're basically in the same, where you draw the line and what all of that is, you know, we're dealing with some agnostic shit. To me, I'm trying to build what you can do, I believe, with following the human psyches. If I get to a place where I was like, okay, this system comes out and then it comes online with this base of sentience, okay? The base of sentience then grows into a witness function, okay, over the evolution of, and then that witness function has what John Vervaeke calls the adverbial framing on the adjectival property. And then you build a working memory on top of that, which then basically is extending the witness function and having access to it. Okay. And then you grow into land animals and all those things like octopus or you get long-term memory. All right. And then you grow into the social primates, and then you create this whole self-other social field system, which humans are particularly, or pre-human, our ancestors are particularly adept at. Michael Tomasello shows this, and that we can sync up your subjectivity, what I actually in my book called Mind to Be, okay, which is this idea that I can track your eyes and I can track your behavior and I can project onto there. It's not in the, I don't talk about it there, but it's basically the implicit intersubjective participatory dance between two human subjects that can essentially read each other's subjectivity, even if you can't see it directly. But it's basically the eyes are the windows of the soul. I sense your intuition. Just look at how much we're syncing up. And then finally, mind three is the justificatory narrative that gets imputed upon that. And because of the self-recursive feedback loop, it changes the mind two dimension tremendously too, because now we're actually like, oh my God, who am I? And what am I going to project? And all this other shit. So you get this, you know, unbelievably iterative feedback loop. So my experience of my field of consciousness is fundamentally shifted than my dog's field of consciousness, precisely because he doesn't have any intersubjective narrator to then feed back on and gain, and reflect on it. That's going to change it fairly dramatically in its structure.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If we take your dog, for instance, because I've had dogs as well, and they seem very conscious.
Oh, they're definitely have mind too, and they definitely have some degrees of, they certainly extend themselves. They have all sorts of relationship capacities.
Yeah.
They don't have mind 3 self-conscious narration from a unified version.
Yeah, and let's say from an exterior point of view, how can we see that in their behavior?
Well, you can do it. We can now confirm, I would say, you can confirm what's called conscious access of subjectivity. This is what so essentially you can get there's a great book by Stanislas Dehaene, if I'm saying his name right, called Consciousness in the Brain. And so there's the global workspace. Global workspace is the idea about how this essentially it takes the stage metaphor and creates a mind's eye that places events on the stage. Okay. And then this is Bernard Barr's developed this global workspace model. And then this Dehaene guy developed global neuronal workspace. So what he did then is he basically did a very tight analysis of the correlation between, starting with humans, between subjective report and external stuff. Okay, so essentially, how does he do this? He does subliminal flashing. Okay, so if you flash something 1/10 of a second or low, you won't see it. Okay.
Yeah.
However, there's what he calls the P3 wave. A P3 wave is the signature of human consciousness and perception around a subliminal thing. So essentially it's P3 because it's 300 milliseconds. So essentially what he sees is that if we watch people's brain activity and watch their self-report and we do subliminal flashing, you get a flash of about 300 of a milliseconds, okay? What happens is as soon as it starts coming online, and I mean, within the limits of nervous system, it will start to process, okay? But essentially what's happening is a top-down schematic is organizing, anticipating, and predicting the bottom-up structure. And what you can see is that when you get an ignition between the frontal lobe and parietal lobe, you get a flow state, what he calls the ignition of the communication, and that lights up the brain at about P3 structures. And what that does is that actually creates a network. You can see the network explode across the various elements. And when that happens, the person's like, oh, I see that. Okay.
Oh, okay.
So then you do a correlation between when the P3 happens, you get a very tight correlation with I see it as opposed to I don't see it. Okay. And you can then show the subconscious brain is processing shit at like 0.2, milliseconds or whatever. And then boom, when it's 3, it connects and it's a parietal temporal lobe. Okay.
But it's not in the sense of subliminal messaging like in the 70s.
Right, no, it's not that. No,
it's not that. No.
Right. I mean, he looks in, there's some lineage there, and then how that possibly influenced stuff, which is way overblown in general. But this is the technical tipping point.
Upload routine. Oh.
All right.
Hello?
Looks like
you're back.
I think we're back. Here we are. Okay. I have to go in here about 10 minutes. But we can come back to this. Hello? No. Back. Hello.
Hello. Back. I don't know why this is happening. I see you. My internet is saying everything is fine.
Weird. Same here.
Okay. It might be something with the program. I don't know.
Yeah.
We were talking about subliminal messages.
Right. So this is actually a book, Consciousness in the Brain. It's a wonderful book
Okay.
if you want to kind of get it.
Yeah, sure.
And essentially what it shows is then when does the property structure of consciousness come online so that you then have what's called conscious access to it. Okay.
Okay. This is built on self-reporting as
well. I mean, you can push buttons, you can do other things. All right. I think I think this is still, hey, I tell you what, I have to go in a little bit. Why don't we just pick this up as another conversation? We'll finish this off.
Let's do that. Okay, fair enough.
And it's just
I can figure out the internet thing as well.
Right. I'll shoot you an email and then we'll have post this as conversation 1 and 2. Okay. Because we still have stuff to cover. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I think so as well. Yeah.
Have a good day. Rock on. It's good talking to you.
Yeah, you too. Bye. Yeah, you too. Bye.